Sophie worked at a small cafe at the corner of a busy street. Every morning before sunrise, she would tie her hair into a messy bun, wear her faded uniform, and take a deep breath before starting another long day. The cafe was always filled with the smell of coffee, fresh bread, and quiet conversations. People came and went, but Sophie stayed, serving, cleaning, smiling, and pretending everything was fine. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the only hope for her small family. Her father had passed away years ago, and her mother was bedridden after an accident. Her younger brother, Leo, was still in school, dreaming of becoming a doctor one day. Sophie wanted to make that dream come true for him no matter how hard it got. She worked double shifts, mornings at the cafe and evenings at a local diner. Most nights, she came home past midnight, her feet sore and her hands smelling of coffee and dish soap. But no matter how tired she was, she never let anyone see her struggle. Every customer at the cafe knew her for her bright smile and kind voice. She would say things like, "Good morning, sir. I hope your day starts with a smile." Or, "Would you like an extra sugar cube today?" It was small, but it made people's mornings a little better. What they didn't know was that sometimes she skipped her own breakfast to make sure Leo had food for school. Sophie's life wasn't easy, but she had learned to find beauty in little things. The first sip of coffee on a cold morning, the laughter of children outside the window, or a kind word from a stranger. She often looked out the cafe window during quiet moments, watching people in suits rushing to work, and wondered what it would feel like to live without worry, to not have to count every penny before paying rent. Still, she never complained. Her coworkers liked her but often pitied her. "Sophie, you need to rest more," one of them said once. "You can't keep working like this." She just smiled and replied softly, "I'll rest when things get better." But deep inside, she wasn't sure when that day would come. At home, Leo always tried to help. He would wait for her with warm tea and ask about her day. "Did anyone tip you today?" he'd ask with hopeful eyes. Sometimes she would nod and say yes even if no one had. She didn't want him to worry. He would tell her about his school projects and friends, and she would listen like it was the most important story in the world. Those were the moments she felt richest, sitting on their old couch, hearing her brother laugh. There were days when Sophie's spirit almost broke. Once, a rude customer yelled at her for mixing up an order. Everyone in the cafe turned to look, and Sophie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She apologized quietly, even though she wasn't at fault. After he left, her manager scolded her too, telling her to be more careful. She wanted to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she went to the restroom, washed her face, looked in the mirror, and whispered, "It's okay, Sophie. Just one more day. You can do it." That was her life, full of small struggles, quiet strength, and hidden dreams. She had no idea that something extraordinary was waiting for her, something that would change her life forever. The next day, as she cleaned the tables and refilled the sugar jars, the morning sun broke through the cafe window, covering her in soft golden light. For a moment, she felt peaceful. She didn't know why, but something in her heart whispered that this day would be different. She brushed it off and went back to work, not realizing that fate had already begun to move in her favor. Soon, a gentle sound of a cane tapping on the floor caught her attention. She turned and saw an elderly woman standing by the door, carefully feeling her way inside. The woman wore a calm smile, her eyes distant but kind. Sophie rushed to help her, not knowing that this small act of kindness would soon change her entire world, and touch hearts she never imagined she'd reach. That morning, as Sophie guided the woman to a seat and offered her a warm cup of tea, she was just being herself, kind, gentle, and genuine. She had no idea that this was the beginning of a story that would one day make everyone cry, including a billionaire who had forgotten what real kindness looked like. The morning was calm, and the cafe was filled with the soft hum of people chatting and the clinking of cups. Sophie was moving quickly between tables, balancing trays and wearing her usual bright smile, even though her legs ached from the long hours she had worked the day before. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the windows, giving everything a warm glow. As she cleaned a corner table, the door opened with a soft chime. Sophie looked up and saw an elderly woman standing there, holding a white cane. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her face carried both grace and sadness. She seemed lost for a moment, gently tapping her cane to find her way inside. Without hesitation, Sophie rushed over. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly, touching the woman's arm gently so she wouldn't be startled. "Let me help you to a seat." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes distant but peaceful. "Thank you, dear. I didn't mean to trouble you," she replied in a calm voice. "It's no trouble at all," Sophie said warmly. "Would you like a seat by the window? There's a little sunshine there. It feels nice." "That would be lovely," the woman replied, allowing Sophie to guide her. Sophie carefully helped her sit down and adjusted the chair so she'd be comfortable. Then she brought her a glass of water. The woman's hands moved gently over the table, finding the glass by touch. Sophie noticed how gracefully she did it, as if she'd lived her whole life navigating the world without sight. "Would you like something to drink?" Sophie asked. "Just tea, please. With honey if you have some," the woman said. "Of course." Sophie smiled and walked away to prepare it. When she returned, she placed the cup carefully in front of her and said, "The handle is at 3 o'clock. The woman paused, a little surprised. "You know how to describe it like that?" she asked, curiosity in her voice. Sophie smiled shyly. "Yes, I used to volunteer at a small center for the blind near my neighborhood. They taught me some basics." The woman's face softened even more. "That's very kind of you. Not many people take the time to understand," she said quietly. Sophie didn't know it, but this simple conversation was already making a deep impression on the woman. Most people treated her differently when they noticed her blindness. Some pitied her, others ignored her. But Sophie's tone had no trace of either. It was just warmth and respect. As the woman sipped her tea, she asked, "What's your name, dear?" "Sophie," she replied with a smile. "And you?" "Margaret," the woman said softly. "It's nice to meet you, Sophie." "It's nice to meet you too, Margaret." They talked a little while. Margaret told her she enjoyed walking alone sometimes, even though her driver insisted it wasn't safe. She said she liked listening to the city sounds, the laughter, the footsteps, the cars. It made her feel alive. Sophie listened carefully, nodding and smiling, her heart warming to the woman's gentle spirit. When Sophie brought her the bill later, Margaret quietly reached into her handbag. She fumbled for her wallet, her fingers searching the pockets, but after a moment, her face showed confusion. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I must have left it at home." Sophie quickly smiled and said, "It's okay, ma'am. Don't worry about it. You can pay next time." "No, I can't let you do that," Margaret protested softly. But Sophie shook her head. "It's really fine. Please don't worry. You made my morning brighter just by coming here." Margaret tilted her head as if studying Sophie, though she couldn't see her face. "You have a kind heart," she said finally. "The world needs more people like you." Sophie felt her eyes sting for a moment. No one had said something like that to her in a long time. She smiled and said quietly, "Thank you, ma'am." Before leaving, Sophie went to the counter, took a small piece of thick paper, and using the little Braille stylus she had at home for practice, she wrote a short message. "You are safe here, and your kindness still matters in this world." She folded it neatly and placed it beside Margaret's teacup, without saying anything. A few minutes later, Margaret stood up, holding her cane, ready to leave. "Thank you for the tea, Sophie," she said softly. "You're welcome any time," Sophie replied, helping her to the door. As Margaret walked away, Sophie felt a strange warmth in her heart, though she couldn't explain why. She didn't know who the woman really was. To her, she was just a kind stranger who deserved a little help. But what Sophie didn't realize was that this moment, This small act of kindness and the hidden Braille message she left behind was about to change her life forever. Outside, Margaret's driver rushed to her, clearly worried, but she simply smiled and said, "Don't worry. I met someone wonderful today." Inside the cafe, Sophie continued her work as if nothing special had happened. Yet somewhere deep down, she felt something different, as if fate had quietly stepped into her ordinary day and planted the beginning of something extraordinary. The cafe was quieter that afternoon. The rush of morning customers had faded, leaving only the soft music playing in the background and the smell of freshly baked cookies filling the air. Sophie was wiping down tables when she noticed Margaret still sitting near the window, slowly finishing her tea. The old woman looked peaceful, her hands gently resting on the table, feeling the texture of the cup as if memorizing its shape. Sophie walked over and smiled. "Would you like some more tea, ma'am?" she asked kindly. Margaret shook her head. "No, dear. I'm fine. I was just enjoying the sound of the rain," she said, turning her face slightly toward the window. Outside, light rain had started to fall, tapping softly against the glass. Sophie pulled out a chair and sat across from her for a moment. She didn't usually do that with customers, but something about Margaret made her feel calm. There was a kindness in her voice, a quiet dignity that drew Sophie in. "Do you come here often?" Sophie asked, curious. Margaret smiled faintly. "No, this is my first time. I used to visit places like this with my husband years ago," she said. "He loved coffee. I just loved being with him." Sophie nodded gently. "He must have been a wonderful man." "Oh, he was," Margaret said softly. "He taught me to never see blindness as a weakness. He used to say, 'You don't need eyes to see goodness, Margaret. You just need a heart that feels it.'" The words touched Sophie deeply. She had always believed that kindness was more important than wealth or looks, but hearing it from someone like Margaret made her believe it even more. A few minutes later, Margaret reached into her handbag, still searching for her wallet. She frowned a little, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said. "I think I've forgotten my purse at home. How careless of me." Sophie quickly waved her hand and smiled. "Please don't worry about it. It's okay, really." Margaret looked concerned. "But that's not right, dear. I can't just walk away without paying." "It's just a cup of tea," Sophie replied softly. "And you've already paid with your company." The older woman smiled, touched by her words. "You're very sweet, Sophie. People like you make the world feel safe again." Sophie felt warmth rise in her chest. She didn't help people to get thanks or praise. She just couldn't walk away when someone needed kindness. Still, hearing those words meant more than she expected. When Margaret turned away for a moment to listen to the rain again, Sophie quietly went to the counter. She took out a small piece of thick paper from her apron pocket. It was something she always kept, scrap paper she used to practice Braille. During her volunteer days at the Blind Center, she had learned how to write simple sentences using a small stylus that pressed dots into paper. She thought for a moment, then carefully wrote a short message. "You are safe here, and your kindness still matters in this world." She folded the paper gently and placed it next to Margaret's cup without saying anything. A few minutes later, Margaret stood up slowly, using her cane to guide herself. Sophie hurried over and helped her put on her coat. "Thank you for the tea, dear," Margaret said softly. "You're welcome any time," Sophie replied with a bright smile. Margaret reached out and touched Sophie's hand. "I'll remember your voice," she said kindly. "It sounds like sunshine." Sophie felt her throat tighten a little. She didn't know what to say, so she just squeezed Margaret's hand lightly. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. After Margaret left, Sophie went back to cleaning tables, not realizing that the small Braille note she left behind would soon find its way into the hands of someone powerful, someone who hadn't cried in years. Outside, Margaret walked toward a black car waiting near the curb. The driver looked relieved to see her. "Ma'am, we were worried. You shouldn't wander off alone," he said gently. Margaret smiled and held up the small folded paper in her hand. "It's all right," she said softly. "I met someone very special today." Back inside the cafe, Sophie felt a strange peace in her heart. She didn't have much money, No fancy clothes, no important name. But that day, she felt rich in a way that couldn't be measured. She didn't know who Margaret really was, but she knew one thing. Helping her had made her feel like the world was a little brighter. What Sophie didn't know was that the small note she had written with so much love and care was about to change her life in ways she could never imagine. The kindness she gave without expecting anything in return was about to come back to her. Multiplied, powerful, and unforgettable. Fate had already begun its work, quietly turning an ordinary afternoon into the start of something extraordinary. The next day at the cafe started like any other. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the sound of chatter and clinking cups made the place feel alive. Sophie moved quickly between tables, smiling at customers, taking orders and wiping down counters. It felt like an ordinary morning, but something in the air was different, heavier, quieter somehow. She didn't know that something big was about to happen. Around noon, the soft bell above the cafe door rang again. At first, no one looked up, but when a man in a dark suit entered, followed by several other men in black coats, the entire cafe fell silent. The sound of heels clicking on the floor echoed as people turned to stare. The man walked with confidence, tall, sharp-featured, and serious. He looked like someone who was used to being obeyed. Sophie froze when she saw him. He didn't look like the usual kind of customer who came in for coffee. His suit looked expensive, his watch shimmered in the light, and the air around him seemed to carry power. The man's eyes scanned the cafe quickly, his expression tense and worried. "Excuse me," he said to the manager, his voice calm but firm. "Was an elderly woman here yesterday? She's about this tall, with silver hair and a white cane." The manager looked confused and pointed toward Sophie. "You might want to ask her. She was serving that lady yesterday." The man turned toward Sophie immediately. "You were with her?" he asked. Sophie nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. She came in for tea." "Is something wrong?" The man took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "She's my mother. She went out yesterday without telling anyone, and we couldn't find her for hours. I've been searching all morning." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. "Your mother?" "Yes," he replied. "Her name is Margaret Huxley." The name made a few people in the cafe whisper. Sophie suddenly realized who he was. Daniel Huxley, the billionaire CEO whose face often appeared on TV and in magazines. He was known for his massive company, his success, and his cold, serious personality. People said he was one of the richest men in the country. And the kind woman who had come for tea yesterday, that was his mother. Sophie's heart started beating faster. "She's fine, sir," she said quickly. "She was here for a while, just resting. She said she enjoyed the tea. I helped her to the car when she left." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Did she say anything else?" Sophie hesitated, remembering the calm smile on Margaret's face. "She said she met someone kind. That's all." For a moment, Daniel's expression softened, but he quickly hid it behind his usual serious look. "Did she leave anything behind?" Sophie looked at the table where Margaret had sat yesterday. Everything was cleaned up, but she remembered the small Braille note she had placed next to the cup. Maybe the woman had taken it. "No, sir," Sophie said carefully. "But she seemed happy." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's good to know," he said, but his tone was still cold, like someone who wasn't used to showing emotions. He looked around the cafe once more, his sharp eyes examining everything. Then he looked back at Sophie. "Thank you," he said finally, "for helping her." "You don't have to thank me," Sophie replied softly. "She was lovely. I just did what anyone would do." But Daniel gave a small, tired smile. Not everyone would. He turned to leave, but before stepping out, he paused for a moment, as if something was bothering him. Then one of his assistants rushed in, holding a small folded paper. "Sir, we found this in your mother's bag," he said. "She asked me to give it to you." Daniel opened it carefully. It was the Braille note Sophie had written. He didn't understand it, but one of his assistants read it aloud. "You are safe here, and your kindness still matters in this world." The cafe went quiet. Daniel stared at the words, speechless. For the first time in years, something in his heart shifted. His jaw tightened as he blinked quickly, trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. The note was short, but it carried a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked back at Sophie again, studying her face, the simple waitress in a worn-out uniform, standing nervously but with kind eyes. He realized instantly that she was the one who had written it. His voice was softer now. "She told me she met someone special," he said quietly. "Now I understand what she meant." Sophie didn't know what to say. She just smiled a little, unsure how to react. Daniel nodded politely, folded the note carefully, and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said again, this time more sincerely. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the cafe in complete silence. When the doors closed behind him, Sophie let out a deep breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her coworkers rushed over, whispering excitedly. That was Daniel Huxley, the billionaire. Sophie nodded slowly, still stunned. She looked at the empty table by the window where Margaret had sat, and a small smile appeared on her lips. She didn't know it yet, but that short encounter had already changed something. The richest man in the city had just read a message from a poor waitress, and it had touched him more deeply than anything money could ever buy. The next morning, Sophie came to work as usual, not knowing that her life was about to change again. The cafe looked peaceful. Sunlight poured through the windows, and the smell of fresh coffee made the air warm and cozy. She tied her apron, brushed her hair back, and began her routine. It felt like a normal day, but she couldn't stop thinking about the man who had come in the day before, Daniel Huxley, the billionaire. She remembered his serious face and how he had reacted when he heard the Braille message. Sophie didn't think much about it then, but something in his eyes had seemed different, almost sad, almost lost. She didn't know what effect her little note had really made. A few hours passed, and the cafe started getting busy. Sophie was serving coffee to a table when the door opened again. The same tall man in a suit walked in, this time without the bodyguards. The whole cafe turned to look. He seemed calmer, less intimidating, but his presence still made everyone whisper. Sophie froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Why would he come back? Daniel walked up to the counter, looking straight at her. "Good morning," he said politely. "Good morning, sir," she replied nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was hoping to talk to you," he said. "About my mother." Sophie nodded quickly. "Of course. Is she okay?" A soft smile appeared on his face, the kind that looked rare for him. "She's fine," he said quietly. "Better than fine. She hasn't stopped talking about you." Sophie blinked, surprised. "About me?" "Yes," he said. "She told me everything. How you helped her. How kind you were. She said you treated her like family. You have no idea how much that means to me." Sophie smiled shyly. "I just did what anyone should do, sir." Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, Sophie. Not everyone would." He pulled out a small folded paper from his pocket, the Braille note. This note touched my mother deeply. She made me promise to have it translated. When I read what you wrote, I understood why." He looked at the note for a long moment before continuing. "You told her, you are safe here, and your kindness still matters in this world. My mother said it reminded her of my father." His voice softened. "He used to tell her the same thing when she lost her sight. That kindness was never small, no matter who it came from." Sophie listened quietly, her heart beating fast. She hadn't realized that her few simple words could mean so much. Daniel continued, "My mother has met so many people in her life. Doctors, assistants, even people who pretend to care because of who she is. But she said you were different. She said your kindness came from a place of honesty." Sophie felt her eyes sting with tears. "She's a wonderful person," she said softly. "She made me feel peaceful just by talking to her." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She has that effect on people. But yesterday, she said something to me I'll never forget." He paused, then smiled slightly as he repeated his mother's words. "Daniel, I may not see the world anymore, but I can still see people's hearts. That girl's heart shines brighter than anything your money can buy." Sophie's breath caught. She didn't know what to say. Daniel looked around the cafe for a moment, then back at her. My mother often tests people's kindness. She likes to go out alone, without telling anyone who she is. She says it helps her see who's truly kind and who's not. Yesterday was one of those days. Sophie's eyes widened. So, she was testing me? Daniel smiled gently. Yes, but you passed with something even more powerful: sincerity. There was a short silence between them. Sophie could hear the faint sound of rain beginning outside. She looked down, blushing slightly. I didn't mean to impress anyone, she said quietly. I just wanted her to feel safe. Daniel nodded. That's exactly why you did. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, You reminded me, and my mother, that there are still good people in the world. And you reminded me of something I'd forgotten for a long time. What kindness actually feels like. Sophie smiled faintly. Sometimes, the world just needs a little kindness, sir. That's all. Daniel's eyes softened even more. He looked almost human now. Not the powerful billionaire people feared, but a son who loved his mother deeply and had just been reminded of something beautiful. Before leaving, he said, My mother wants to see you again. She said she has something important to tell you. Could you come to our home tomorrow afternoon? Sophie hesitated, shocked. Your home? I don't know if I should. Daniel smiled reassuringly. Please. It would mean a lot to her. And to me. Sophie nodded slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. Okay, I'll come. As Daniel left, the cafe seemed brighter somehow. Sophie stood by the counter, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. Disbelief, nervousness, and a quiet kind of joy. She looked out the window at the falling rain, whispering to herself, All I did was write a small note. But deep down, she was beginning to understand. Sometimes, even the smallest act of kindness can reach the hearts of people you never expected. And her words, written in tiny Braille dots, had just opened the eyes of a billionaire. The next afternoon, Sophie stood outside a huge iron gate, feeling her heart pound in her chest. She had never seen such a big house in her life. The mansion behind the gate looked like something out of a dream. Tall white pillars, a garden full of colorful flowers, and a fountain that sparkled under the sun. She felt small just standing there, clutching her old handbag nervously. A security guard came forward. Miss Sophie? He asked politely. Yes, she said, her voice shaky. Mr. Huxley and Mrs. Huxley are expecting you. Please, come inside. The gates opened slowly, and Sophie walked through, her shoes clicking softly on the stone path. Her heart was racing. She had no idea what to expect. When she reached the front door, a butler welcomed her and led her inside. The house was beautiful. Everything polished and shining, with paintings and chandeliers everywhere. Sophie felt awkward in her simple dress, but she reminded herself to stay calm. Then she saw Margaret sitting in a large armchair near the window, smiling warmly. Sophie, dear, you came, Margaret said in her gentle voice. Sophie's nervousness melted a little. She hurried forward and took Margaret's hands. Of course I came, ma'am. How are you feeling today? I'm much better now, Margaret said, squeezing her hand. It's good to hear your voice again. Sit with me. Sophie sat beside her, feeling more comfortable. A few seconds later, Daniel entered the room, wearing a light gray suit. He didn't look as serious as before. In fact, he looked peaceful. Hello again, Sophie, he said with a kind smile. Hello, sir, she replied politely. Margaret turned her head slightly toward her son. Daniel, I want you to tell her everything, she said softly. Daniel nodded and sat across from Sophie. I suppose my mother told you that she likes going out alone sometimes, he began. Sophie nodded. Yes, she mentioned that. Well, Daniel said, glancing at his mother, she does it for a reason. You see, ever since my father passed away, she's been searching for something, or rather, for someone. Sophie frowned slightly. Someone? Yes, Margaret said with a smile. Someone who sees people with their heart, not their eyes. My husband always believed kindness is the truest form of wealth. After he died, I wanted to see if the world still had that kind of kindness left. Sophie listened quietly, her heart full. Margaret continued, I go out without telling anyone who I am. Sometimes I pretend to be lost or struggling, just to see how people will treat me. Most people are polite at first until they realize I'm blind. Then they either pity me or walk away quickly. Daniel added softly. Some even treat her badly. They think she's just an old woman in the way. Sophie's eyes widened. That's awful, she said. Margaret nodded sadly. It happens more often than you'd think. But then, yesterday I met you. You didn't treat me like a burden. You didn't pity me or ignore me. You spoke kindly, helped me, and even gave me that Braille note. She smiled warmly. You reminded me of the goodness I thought the world had lost. Sophie's cheeks flushed pink. I didn't do anything special, ma'am. I just wanted you to feel comfortable. Margaret reached out and touched Sophie's cheek gently. That's what makes you special, dear. You did it without expecting anything back. Daniel leaned forward, his tone sincere. You passed my mother's little test, in a way no one else ever has. When she came home yesterday, she was glowing. She told me your words changed her day, and reminded her of my father. Sophie smiled softly, her eyes shining. He must have been a wonderful man. He was, Margaret said proudly. And you reminded me of him. The room went quiet for a moment. The soft sound of the fountain outside could be heard through the window. Margaret then said, You know, Sophie, I may not have my sight, but I can feel honesty. And when I met you, I felt something pure, something the world rarely shows anymore. Sophie didn't know what to say. Tears filled her eyes. Ma'am, you're very kind to say that. But really, I just did what anyone should do. Margaret chuckled gently. Oh no, my dear. If everyone did what you did, the world would be a much better place. Daniel smiled and added, My mother told me last night that she wants to do something for you, to thank you properly. Sophie shook her head quickly. Please, sir, that's not necessary. I didn't help her for a reward. Daniel smiled more warmly now. I know. That's exactly why you deserve it. Margaret nodded in agreement. Sometimes, the people who expect nothing are the ones who deserve everything, she said softly. Sophie lowered her head, trying not to cry. She had never been praised like this in her life. All her hard days, all her struggles suddenly felt worth it. Margaret reached for her hand again and said, You've reminded us both of something precious, Sophie. That real kindness still exists, even in a world full of noise and greed. Sophie smiled through her tears. I'm just happy I met you, she said quietly. Margaret squeezed her hand gently. Oh, my dear, I think we met for a reason. And as Daniel watched his mother and the humble waitress talk, he realized she was right. This simple girl had brought light back into their lives, not through money or power, but through the smallest, most human act of all. Kindness. Sophie sat quietly in the grand living room, still unsure why Margaret and Daniel had asked her to visit. The soft ticking of a golden clock on the wall was the only sound in the room. She felt nervous but also curious. Something about the way Daniel and his mother were looking at her made her heart beat faster. Not from fear, but from a strange feeling that something big was about to happen. Margaret smiled kindly and said, Sophie, my dear, I want to tell you something important. Sophie leaned forward a little, trying to hide her trembling hands. Yes, ma'am? Margaret took a deep breath and said, Yesterday, after you helped me, I went home and told my son everything. I told him how a kind waitress guided me across the street, talked to me gently, and even gave me a note written in Braille. No one has ever done something so thoughtful for me before. You reminded me of humanity, Sophie. Sophie's eyes softened. I'm so glad I could help, ma'am. It really wasn't a big thing. Margaret shook her head and smiled. It was, dear. To you it may have been small, but to me it meant the world. You saw me not as a blind woman but as a person. That is rare. Daniel looked at Sophie with admiration. My mother rarely connects with people, he said. But when she spoke about you, I knew there was something special about you. Sophie didn't know how to respond. She had never been called special before. Her whole life had been about surviving, paying bills, working extra shifts, and keeping her head down. Margaret continued, her tone becoming serious. Sophie, I've spent years surrounded by people who only care about our money. Servants who flatter, guests who gossip, and business partners who smile only when it's useful. But yesterday, for the first time in a long while, I met someone real. That's why I want to make you an offer. One that could change your life. Sophie's heart stopped for a second. An offer? She repeated quietly. Yes, Margaret said. I want you to come work for me. Not as a maid or waitress, but as my personal companion. Someone I can trust. Someone who can read to me, talk to me, and help me feel the world again. In return, I'll make sure you're paid well, enough to never struggle again. Sophie froze, unable to believe what she had just heard. Ma'am, I don't know what to say, she whispered. Daniel smiled gently. You can start by saying yes. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. She had worked in the same small cafe for years, earning barely enough to survive. The thought of leaving that behind to live and work in a place where she was valued felt like a dream. But a part of her hesitated. Sir, ma'am, I'm honored, she said softly. But I'm just a simple girl. I don't think I belong in a house like this. Margaret reached forward and touched her hand. Oh, Sophie, you belong anywhere your heart takes you. You've already proven that you have more grace and kindness than most people I know. And kindness, she said with a smile, is worth more than money or manners. Sophie's lips trembled. You really mean it? You want me to stay here? Margaret nodded. I do. And Daniel agrees. Daniel nodded too, his expression sincere. You've brought something to this house that's been missing for years, Sophie. Warmth. Sophie wiped her tears quickly, embarrassed. Thank you, both of you. I never thought someone like me would get such a chance. But, are you sure? Margaret chuckled. My dear, when you get to my age, you learn to trust your heart. And my heart tells me you're meant to be here. For a moment, Sophie couldn't speak. Everything inside her wanted to say yes, but she still felt overwhelmed. Her thoughts drifted to her small apartment, her unpaid bills, and her lonely nights. Then she looked at Margaret's kind smile and Daniel's calm eyes, and suddenly, she knew this was more than a job offer. It was a new beginning. I accept, she said at last, her voice breaking slightly. I'd be honored to help you. Margaret's face lit up with joy. Wonderful. Oh, my dear. I can't tell you how happy that makes me. She reached out and hugged Sophie gently. Daniel smiled too. Welcome to our family, Sophie. The words hit her harder than she expected. Family. It had been so long since she'd heard anyone say that to her. Her eyes filled with tears again. But this time, they were tears of happiness. Margaret held her hand tightly. I knew the day I met you that something beautiful would come of it. You've given me hope, and now I want to give you a better life. Sophie nodded, still speechless. In her heart, she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. A feeling of being seen, appreciated, and loved for who she truly was. As she left the mansion that evening, the sun was setting over the garden. The golden light made everything glow softly. Sophie looked back at the house and whispered to herself, maybe life really can change overnight. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in forever, she felt something powerful, hope. And little did she know, her decision that day would not only change her own life, but also transform the hearts of everyone around her forever. Weeks passed, and Sophie's life began to change in ways she had never imagined. Living in the Huxley mansion felt like stepping into another world. Every morning, she helped Margaret with her breakfast, read her favorite books aloud, and described the gardens outside in bright, colorful words. Margaret would listen with a gentle smile, imagining every detail Sophie spoke of. The red roses, the golden sunlight, the sound of birds on the balcony. But beyond her daily tasks, Sophie brought something deeper into the house. Laughter, warmth, and kindness. The maids loved her humble nature, and even the guards smiled when she passed by. Daniel often found himself stopping by the library just to hear his mother and Sophie talking and laughing together. It reminded him of a time long ago before his father passed away. A time when the mansion felt alive. One sunny afternoon, Margaret and Sophie sat together in the garden. The scent of jasmine filled the air. Margaret reached out for Sophie's hand and said softly, "You've brought life back to this place, my dear. I feel young again when you're around." Sophie smiled. "It's because you have a kind heart, ma'am. You make everyone feel at home." Margaret chuckled. "Oh, don't flatter me. You know it's true the other way around." They both laughed. As the days turned into months, Sophie became more than just an employee. She became family. She cared for Margaret like her own mother, and Daniel often joined their conversations, listening quietly as they spoke about life, dreams, and memories. He began to admire Sophie's simplicity and the strength hidden behind her gentle words. Then one morning, Sophie found Margaret sitting quietly with a Braille paper in her lap. "What's that, ma'am?" she asked curiously. Margaret smiled faintly. "It's something I've been working on. But today, it's your turn to write." "Mine?" Sophie looked confused. "Yes," Margaret said. "I want you to write something in Braille for me. Something from your heart. A message that I can keep forever." Sophie's heart softened. She had never written something so personal before, especially not in Braille. But she agreed. She took Margaret's Braille slate and stylus and sat down beside her. For a long time, Sophie stayed quiet, thinking. Then slowly, she began to press each dot carefully, forming words one by one. Margaret listened to the small tapping sounds with a peaceful smile. When Sophie finished, she gently handed the sheet to Margaret. "What did you write, dear?" Margaret asked softly. Sophie smiled shyly. "You'll have to read it yourself, ma'am." Margaret laughed lightly and began running her fingers across the raised dots. Her face was calm at first, but soon her lips trembled. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached the last line. Daniel, who had just entered the room, froze when he saw his mother crying. "Mother? What's wrong?" he asked quickly. Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. She clutched the paper to her chest and whispered, "It's beautiful." Daniel came closer and took the Braille note gently. "What did she write?" he asked softly. Margaret smiled through her tears. She wrote, "Thank you for showing me that kindness still exists. You may not see the world with your eyes, but you see it with your heart, and that's the most beautiful kind of sight." Daniel looked at Sophie, speechless. The room went silent except for the sound of the wind rustling through the curtains. Margaret held Sophie's hand tightly and said, "My dear, I've met many people in my life, but you, Sophie, have touched my heart in a way no one ever has. This message, it's something I will treasure forever." Tears filled Sophie's eyes. "I just wanted you to know how much you mean to me," she whispered. Daniel's voice was soft but full of emotion. "You've changed both our lives, Sophie. You've given us something no money could ever buy, peace." Margaret nodded, smiling warmly. "You came into our lives like a light in the dark. And now, I see the world again. Not through my eyes, but through your kindness." Sophie couldn't stop her tears anymore. "You gave me a family when I had none," she said. "I'll never forget that." Margaret gently wiped Sophie's tears. "And I'll never forget you, my dear." That evening, as the sun set over the garden, Daniel stood with Sophie near the balcony. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink. "You know," he said softly, "my mother hasn't been this happy in years. You've done something even I couldn't." Sophie smiled. "She healed me too. I used to think kindness didn't matter anymore, but she proved me wrong." Daniel looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "Maybe that's why fate brought you to her." Sophie looked up at the glowing sky. "Maybe it did," she said quietly. Inside the house, Margaret sat in her chair, holding the Braille message close to her heart. She whispered softly to herself, "Love doesn't need sight. It needs feeling." From that day on, Sophie continued to live with the Huxleys, not as a servant but as part of their family. The mansion, once cold and silent, became warm again, filled with laughter, stories, and the sound of friendship. And that simple Braille message, written by a poor waitress with a kind heart, became more than words. it became a reminder that kindness can heal, love can change lives, and sometimes, one small act of care can touch hearts forever. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come from wealth or power. They come from compassion, the kind that shines even in the darkest moments and teaches everyone what it truly means to see.